My intent is to respond to this YouTube video in which the individual claims that Neil deGrasse Tyson is wrong about God and claims to then provide evidence for God's existence, which I intend to debunk and dismantle. I will say this. I am not one to insult anyone for their beliefs. I won't insult you for your beliefs. I don't insult anyone for their beliefs. Depending on how they present those beliefs. If you were to come up to me one day and say, hi, I believe in God, honestly, my reaction would just be to shrug and say, okay, good for you. That's fine. I have no issue with this. What you believe is up to you. The fact is, if you believe in God, then you believe purely on faith. And again, this is something I'm not going to argue with anyone unless they give me sufficient reason to. If you invite discourse, then I am more than willing to offer my opinion. And if if you were to attack my beliefs or insult me for my beliefs, if you've seen my responses, my reactions to Kent Hovind, you know about how well that turns out. So I'm responding to this video of an individual claiming, that he's providing evidence for God's existence. A little bit of background. I'll give you some background on what it is that I believe and where I stand on multiple things, actually. Because this is going to become relevant, and I may need to use a specific term to describe a few things. So let me delve into my ideology a little bit. It's an ideology I developed myself, beginning about 15 years ago. I started to explore the notion that that basically the universe and everything in it operates on the basis of causality, that is, cause and effect. There is nothing in the universe, or that's occurring in the universe, at least as far as our knowledge, that is not an effect of a cause. Now, this gets a little bit sketchy when you get into the realm of quantum physics. I contend that causality still applies there. However, that is more or less a matter of faith itself, because things do begin to appear random on the quantum level. So, but for the purposes of my ideology, we're assuming that the entire universe operates on the basis of causality, and nothing is exempt from that, with the potential exception of the universe itself and the Big Bang, or whatever it is that initiated the universe. The Big Bang is, currently the best model we have. We're not sure what may have preceded that, if anything. That may be an exception to this idea of causality That may be this uncaused cause that we will address later. Or, for that matter, the universe may be a causality. The causality of the universe may be cyclical in nature, and maybe it's just this infinite loop of causality. It gets really, at that point, all we have is speculation. So my ideology is based on the idea that, the universe operates according to causality, and nothing is exempt from that. And the idea is that what constitutes the acquisition of knowledge is essentially an assessment of that causality and tracing cause and effect. Anytime you're acquiring knowledge of anything, you are essentially answering the question, why or how does this happen, or did this happen? Why or how did this come about? And so I refer to the entire universe, this ongoing sequence of and expanding sequence of causality as the causal web. And what we're doing by obtaining knowledge is, for lack of a better term, illuminating these paths of causality. But doing that, you will inevitably reach a point at which the answer to why or how did this happen, the honest answer to it, is, I don't know, apparently it just did, or it just does. This just appears to be the case, and we have to take it at face value, at least for the time being, until such time as we have a sufficient explanation for it. And that point, and by the way, this point exists, there are points like that referring to all of human knowledge. The singularity that produced the Big Bang, for example, would be an example of this. And the term I coined for that is axiomatic threshold, which again is exactly, I know those are two rather big words. Axiomatic means like self-evident, or it just is, which is what we're saying here. And so it's exactly what the term implies. It's the point at which you're saying, I don't know what caused this, but it appears to be. And that exists for human knowledge as a whole, and it also exists for people personally. There may be things that can be explained and that we do have explanations for, but for which a particular individual might not understand or be aware of the explanations. And so for them, that point constitutes an axiomatic threshold. And this will come up later. My ideology is, and there's, did I mention this earlier? I've got this entire fictional universe, and that's where the term for my ideology, Maverick Knight, comes from, and my own self-appointed title, Master Maverick, within that. Anyway, that will most likely, it will come up later in one form or another. Regarding God, I describe myself as an agnostic atheist. To explain what that means, because I'm sure there are going to be people who, if they hear that, will claim that that's a contradiction in terms, being that an agnostic is someone who is not sure whether or not God exists, and an atheist is someone who believes God does not exist. At least I know there's going to be there's potentially a huge amount of disagreement and controversy about what these terms mean. Those are two definitions that exist, and I mean, there will be other people who claim other definitions. But to explain where I stand on this and what I mean by referring to myself as an agnostic atheist, when you ask, does God exist? Is there a God? When we say God, there are really there's a distinction we need to make, because there are two general ideas about what God refers to. The first is God as a mythological figure. And I know, if you follow a religion, you don't see your God as a mythological figure. Again, that's your choice, that's your decision, but I'm telling you, he is a mythological figure. Believe what you want, this is where I stand. The Judeo-Christian God, the Muslim God, Allah, I think Hinduism is multi-deistic, right? There are multiple gods in Hinduism. I believe all of these fall under the category of mythological gods, as do ancient religions like the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks, and modern religion like Judaism, Christianity, Islam. These are modern permutations of these ancient mythologies. And so where did those come from? Well, our ancestors, as I'm sure you're well aware, did not have a great deal of knowledge about the world around them. But they lived in an environment which, by all accounts, was constantly trying to murder them. You've got natural disasters, you've got wild animals that they might encounter, you've got diseases. And so things were really fucking scary. And what you want in that position, what is natural for a person to want in that position, is one, an explanation for, all of these things, naturally observed phenomena, diseases, the world around us. We have an inherent desire for knowledge. We have an inherent desire for an explanation. We want to understand things because it aids us in survival. But the other thing that you would want under those circumstances is not just an understanding, but if possible, a means of exerting some manner of control over these phenomena which threaten your survival. And so the natural progression of that desire is that it would manifest as this kind of mythology. People did the best they could to explain these things, and with the motive of obtaining some manner of control over them. And so we developed, religion developed, and what religion is and what God is the imposition of the human ego on the unknown. So let's just, take for example that you've got a thunderstorm, right? And to our primitive ancestors, that was pretty fucking scary. You've got a thunderstorm, you've got thunder, you've got lightning. You could get struck by lightning and die. It was not... Sorry, excuse me for a moment. It was not an ideal situation, for them to be in. Uh, so again, for example, you're dealing with a thunderstorm. You've got thunder, lightning. You're scared. You want to understand it, and ideally, you would like to control it. You can't very well convince yourself that you've got control over it directly. You can try, and I'm sure our primitive ancestors, probably that would be the first thing they would have attempted, is to convince themselves that they've got some manner of direct control over it, but that idea is not going to last very long. Because you can convince yourself of it, and then, lightning is going to strike again. And it becomes very obvious to you very quickly that you have no control over this situation. So naturally, they did the next best thing. They explained it by imagining that there were, supernatural versions of themselves. There were these humanoid creatures who were much more powerful than they are, who were controlling these things. And if you appease them, then they will control these things, in your favor, or they'll look out for you. They'll you'll be safe. Because these beings, you'll have won their favor. And they will control all of these things on your behalf. That you can convince yourself of. Because when it inevitably fails, you can tell yourself, well, maybe I wasn't trying hard enough, maybe I wasn't appeasing these beings properly. And so that was the most appealing explanation. The idea of God's controlling everything. That way, you've got something that will control all of these things that you're afraid of on your behalf. And as we advanced, we learned that there were not gods controlling those things. Those were natural phenomena that were occurring due to, a variety of circumstances and variables. And so the idea of God got pushed back onto, what was still unknown. Then it was, maybe God's kind of merged into a singular God. That's just efficiency. So the case became, maybe God isn't controlling these things directly, but he created, the earth and created all of these systems and variables that are producing these events, and he's still in control of them. So again, we may feel threatened by these things, but we will pray to God and he will take care of us. And if he doesn't, then we were praying to him properly, or he just works in mysterious ways and it's actually for the greater good. And the religion kind of evolved in that manner. God always occupying an axiomatic threshold. That's where axiomatic thresholds is where, for believers in the supernatural, that's where the supernatural manifests at an axiomatic threshold. You don't understand something, rather than saying, I don't know why that is or how that got there. You say, God must be responsible for it. And so those motives are still with us today. We're afraid of death, and I mean rightly so. I think to some extent, at least, we're all a little bit afraid of death. And so we've got this idea that, we've got a God and there's a heaven and an afterlife, and, if I'm going to die, yes, but I won't really be dead. Because some part of me will, I will live on in this other form. So, yeah, personally, I don't believe in that. I think it's motivated by this, fear and this desire to control what we don't understand. It's the imposition of the human ego on the unknown for our own purposes. And so, that's what God is. And so when we're talking about that kind of God, when we're talking about the God of any given religion, I'm highly, highly certain that that God does not exist. It's anything's possible. I don't know very much, about none of us really know that much about the nature of the universe. Anything is possible, but that is very, very unlikely because that image of God is overwhelmingly consistent with mythology. So in that sense, I am very much an atheist. In the term which I, in the under the definition which I'd mentioned before. So like, again, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, my opinion, all bullshit. Wrong, not, it's mythology. The second concept of God is just some designer of the universe. When you're asking if that kind of God exists, you're asking, was the universe intentionally designed? My response to that, I have no fucking clue. Neither do you, neither do any of us. We know so little about the universe and how, we understand, again, we have a good model for where it came from, how it began, the Big Bang. What was that and what caused it, if anything? Don't know. I don't know. And anyone who tells you they do know, unless there is some, scientifically supported theory that I haven't, that I'm unaware of, anyone who tells you they do know is lying. Again, that's an axiomatic threshold, and if you want to believe in God, that tends to be where he manifests. And that's the other funny thing about God is I've always found it amusing that God would be a he. What the fuck does God need with a gender? If anything, God should be an it, no? So when asked, is there a God who designed the universe? Was the universe designed with some kind of intention? I don't know. And if we're being honest, I don't know, you don't know, nobody knows. 50-50. That's where we stand. Was the universe designed intentionally? 50-50. And that's that's being honest. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to, I think I've covered everything that I wanted to cover. I'm an agnostic atheist. I'm a Maverick Knight. That is my ideology. Again, that's the ideology I developed myself. It's analogous to my religion, if you want to, categorize it that way. It really isn't a religion at all. But, anyway, I think we can go ahead and get started on this video now. Again, I'm trying to think. I'm like, because I swear I'm going to watch this later and I'm going to go, I forgot to cover this. But no, maybe, if I think of anything, I'll go ahead and insert it. So we're going to go ahead and start on this video. And I'm going to respond to it. I will play it here. What I'm going to do, I think, is insert the video and then insert my response to it. So let's look this up. I believe it... Yeah. The YouTube title it's under is Capturing Christianity. The YouTube channel. And the title is Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson is 100% wrong, in all caps, about God.
Hi.
So here we go. Oh, we got an ad. Hi, Bernie. I support you, but at the moment I'm trying to watch a YouTube video, so shut the fuck up.
Hey everyone, I'm Cameron Bertuzzi, and in this video, I'm going to explain why Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson is wrong about God. So I was browsing YouTube the other day, as I often do, and came across a little 2-minute video of Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson giving his opinion about God's existence. Well, since it's a relatively short video, it's only 2 minutes long, I'm actually going to play the whole thing out for you, and then I'll give my response in its entirety afterwards. Before I play the clip, this is just a quick reminder that I currently support my wife and 2 kids through this ministry, so if you find value in the work that I do on Capturing Christianity, please consider supporting me on Patreon. That's patreon.com/capturingchristianity. For $5 a month, you can gain early access to videos just like this one. And you can also gain access to a private Facebook group called the Bereans, where I post really cool videos and do little private chats for everybody in there. So make sure to check me out on patreon.com/capturingchristianity. Now, if you can't support me financially, but you'd still like to support my ministry, then you can do that by liking this video, subscribing to my channel, and even sharing these videos with your friends. Thank you in advance, no matter what you do, even if you're just watching. So thank you. All right, let's watch the clip from Dr. Tyson.
The more I look at the universe, just the less convinced I am that there is something benevolent going on. So if your concept of a creator is someone who's all powerful and all good, that's not an uncommon pairing of powers that you might ascribe to a creator. All powerful and all good. And I look at disasters that afflict Earth and life on Earth. Volcanoes, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, disease, pestilence, congenital birth defects. You look at this list of ways that life is made miserable on Earth by natural causes. And I just ask, how do you deal with that? So philosophers rose up and said, if there is a God, God is either not all powerful or not all good. I have no problems if, as we probe the origins of things, we bump up into the bearded man. If that shows up, we're good to go. Okay? Not a problem. There's just no evidence of it. And this is why religions are called faiths, collectively. Because you believe something in the absence of evidence. That's what it is. That's why it's called faith. Otherwise, we would call all religions evidence. But we don't, for exactly that reason. So I'm given what everyone describes to be the properties that would be expressed by an all-powerful being in the gods that they worship. I look for that in the universe and I don't find it. So I remain unconvinced. But if you've got some good evidence, bring it.
I'm just going to stop here and say that I believe Dr. Tyson is 100% correct here. Whether you like it or not, there is no evidence for God. You believe on faith. I don't know, why is that so hard to accept? You believe on faith. You want to believe in God, that's fine. Don't try to convince me. You have no evidence. I know you think you do, and I'm going to explain to you why you don't. But, and by the way, real quick, because I think this, this applies to all 3 of these points. Every time someone claims to have evidence for God, they go, I've got evidence. I can show you sometimes they actually go so far as to say they're going to prove to you that God exists. Sometimes they're just saying this is compelling evidence. And what it always is something they don't understand or something they can't explain. And what did I say before? Axiomatic threshold. I don't know why this is, but God must have done it. That's what it always comes down to. It's something you personally don't understand, and that's not how evidence works. You need, like I always say when I'm talking about Kent Hovind and his, dumb fuck ramblings. Evidence of God. Show me your God creating something. Show me, have your God, reveal himself in some manner. Show me your God creating something. Not just something that you don't know how it got there, so you're going, well, God did that. I mean, show me definitively, something just appearing out of nowhere. Like I was saying, again, when I was talking about Kent Hovind and his nonsense, I'll settle for, it doesn't even have to be life. Because that's what, the analogy that he used to things that were designed. I was like, well, then show me your God creating life. And as a matter of fact, I'll settle for a rock. It doesn't have to be alive. Show me your God creating a rock. Pray, and then have a rock appear out of nowhere. Then I'll believe you. That would be evidence. Your inability to explain something is not evidence. That is just evidence that you don't understand something. Congratulations. You don't get it. You don't understand it. That's fine. Doesn't mean that whatever deity you choose to believe in must have done it. What would also qualify as evidence? A sign, okay? But a definitive sign. Something that can't be explained any other way. You could ask for a specific message to be written somewhere in some way. If you gave a detailed, a message, and at that moment it materialized in clouds in the sky, that would be very strong evidence. These are all, you need compelling evidence. Not just pointing at something you can't explain and saying, that means God. It doesn't. So, sorry, let's continue.
Now, Dr. Tyson doesn't claim to be an expert on religion, but in our society, if you are a scientist or even dress like a scientist, your opinion on religion suddenly carries a lot more weight. And so what we're going to see throughout this video is that being an expert in science doesn't necessarily translate to being an expert in religion.
Scientists, by definition, and by what the word science means, are particularly qualified to speak about, what exists and what reality is. So the idea that, they may not be qualified in the context of your religion to speak about it, they're definitely qualified to assess how realistic it is.
I'm going to make three main points in my response. First, I'm going to argue that his claim that there's no evidence for God is false. Second, I'm going to argue that his treatment of faith is misguided. And third, I'm going to argue that Dr. Tyson's views on religion lack sophistication.
Okay, good. Like I said, I only watched half this video the first time. What I didn't realize was that those 3 points, listening to it again, I think we're going further than just those 3 points. Those 3 points are within the first thing he wants to demonstrate. So, okay. Going into the second half of this blind anyway.
To start things off, let's review what Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson says about the evidence for God's existence.
I have no problems if, as we probe the origins of things, we bump up into the bearded man. If that shows up, we're good to go. Okay? Not a problem. There's just no evidence of it.
Now, I know that Dr. Tyson is using like a little boomer humor here, but I feel like I should still point out that Christians have never thought about God as like a bearded man floating around in the clouds in the sky.
They don't now. I wouldn't be so sure that they never did. I think in the early days of Christianity, I'm pretty sure many of them, if not all of them, believed that he was literally up there in the sky. You know, that's where the common image of heaven comes from. I think they thought that the clouds were, you know, the floor of heaven, and that's as far as it went. You know, I don't think they had any concept of space, and I do think that they, you know, look at the Sistine Chapel. You know, you've got God, you know, holding out his finger or whatever the fuck it is, like E.T. Yeah, I think they actually did at one point. I might be mistaken about that. It's not very important to the point here. But I mean, it's good that you acknowledge that definitely, you know, Neil deGrasse Tyson was speaking. He was speaking figuratively. I know that he is probably aware that most Christians nowadays don't expect to, you know, as we probe the heavens, actually stumble upon this, you know, bearded figure who would be God.
1 Timothy 6:16 says that no one has seen or can see God. And the Old Testament even forbids making images or idols of God for purposes of worship. See Exodus 24-5 and Deuteronomy 4:15-16. But the main thing I want to focus on in this video is his claim that there's no evidence for God.
Again, I'm going to repeat this one more time before we get into it. There is no evidence for God. There isn't any. Now proceed to explain the three things you don't understand that you think are now like suddenly evidence for God because you don't understand them.
Well, in fact, I did a whole video in response to this claim from another atheist, so if you want to give that a watch, check for it in the description. Now first, Dr. Tyson's assertion that there's no evidence for God is just a little bit ironic since he didn't give any evidence that there's no evidence for God's existence.
What? What? I'm sorry, dude. I'm not trying to be insulting here. But with all due respect, what the fuck do you mean? What is evidence that there's no evidence for something? Could you please explain that? You're going to need to elaborate. What would constitute evidence that there is no evidence for something? That's a ridiculous concept. I think the inability to provide evidence is evidence that there's no evidence. I'm like this. Just explaining this requires me to say the word evidence far too much. It is evidently evident that there is no evidence. You don't need evidence that there is no evidence. The inability to provide evidence is the evidence that there's no evidence. It depends on whether we're talking about evidence that we are aware of or any evidence that might exist anywhere in the universe. Because I myself can't claim that there is no evidence for God. There might be some out there somewhere. But we don't have any. That means there is no evidence. If you're unable to provide any, and I'm going to demonstrate that you are, then there's no evidence. If you're on trial for murder, okay, and you were to say to the prosecution, what's your evidence against me? And they go, then they have no evidence against you. You don't have to provide evidence that they don't have evidence. If they fail to provide any, they don't have any. That's how that works. I'm like, what? I need to. You need to explain what's going on in your head when you say that. Are you talking about providing evidence that God does not exist? Because this goes back to the burden of proof. And I know that theists rather, well, the two are basically the same thing, but theists like to try to shift the burden of proof onto atheists by saying, well, you're the one claiming that God doesn't exist. But that's not how it works. See, because again, let's use our analogy and assume that you're on trial for murder. It's the same. It's on the prosecution to prove that you did commit it, whether you were charged with murder in the first place or whether you just stood up one day apropos of nothing and said, I haven't killed anyone. I mean, the fact that you would say that out of nowhere might be a little bit suspicious. But again, that's not even what's happening here. That's not what's happening in the analogous situation, because we didn't, atheists didn't stand up and just out of nowhere say, there's no God. God was proposed first. The accusation was made. You said, theists said they came up with this explanation, there's a God who's controlling everything, and atheists went, no, I don't believe that, and you're going to have to provide some evidence to demonstrate that your God is even likely. So, no, the burden of proof is firmly on you, and we don't need to supply you with evidence that there is no evidence. Either you put forth some evidence, or you don't have any. That's how this works.
If theists can't just claim that God exists and get away with it, Dr. Tyson can't just claim that there's no evidence for God and get away with it.
As I explained, yes, he can. Yes, he absolutely can. If you are claiming something exists without evidence, there's no reason to believe it. If I claim leprechauns exist and you say, can you provide any evidence for it? And I go, no, they just do. Then you have every reason not to believe me. And you can just say you have no evidence. Because I don't. Or if my evidence makes no sense, same thing. If my evidence doesn't support the existence of leprechauns, if you say, what's your evidence? And I don't know, pull out a rubber chicken and hit myself in the face with a pie and go, aha! Leprechauns! Yeah, that's not evidence. So, I hope that's obvious. That should be obvious, but yeah. If you can't offer compelling evidence, then yes, we can absolutely claim you have no evidence. That's how this works. I'm sorry, but I can't believe I need to explain this. You don't ever need to provide evidence that there is no evidence for something. Failure to provide evidence means there's no evidence.
There's no rule in philosophy or in anything that says only theists are responsible for defending the things that they claim.
You have the burden of proof when you are arguing the affirmative. We are rejecting your claim. This is not a claim of our own. We're rejecting your claim.
Second, the claim that there's no evidence for God is just a myth. It's kind of like the saying, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. It might be fun to say, but in reality, apples don't keep doctors away.
Well, you're right, that definitely is a saying. and it's got no scientific basis. You're right that an apple a day doesn't keep the doctor away. But you're claiming, I mean, there is, and I'm telling you, and I'm going to explain why in the course of this video, there is no evidence for God. That's a true statement. Just saying that's like this other thing that isn't true doesn't make it not true. You know, if I say the sky is blue, or if you know, let's put me in the ridiculous position here. If you come to me and tell me, even better, if you come to me and say the Earth is round, and I say to you, that's a myth. That's just a saying, like an apple a day keeps the doctor away. See how ridiculous that is? The Earth is round, and an apple a day keeps the doctor away. They're not equivalent. Okay? You're not just going to like associate a fact with a false saying and make it false by association.
And in reality, there's loads of evidence for God's existence. Recently, a book came out called 24 or So Arguments for God, edited by Jerry Walls, if you can see it, and Trent Doherty. This book features dozens of peer-reviewed articles from dozens of PhD philosophers giving arguments and evidence for God's existence.
I mean, I'll look into that sometime, I will. Are any of those better than the evidence you're going to provide in this video? I'll look into it, but I really don't want to waste my time, and I have a very strong feeling that the evidence in that book is going to be very similar to the evidence you're providing in this video. That is to say, completely wrong.
Now, some of the arguments in here are new, and that's really exciting, but many of the ideas, the core ideas focused on in this book, have been around for centuries.
See, that was my suspicion. The ones that have been around for centuries, it's very likely I've already heard them. I've had this discussion many, many times. I've heard the most confident theists come to me and say, this proves God exists. And it was exactly the kind of bullshit you're about to put forth.
For example, the contingency argument for God's existence has been around since at least the 9th century and has been talked about by philosophers ever since. So when Dr. Tyson says there's no evidence for God, really what he's doing is he's announcing his unfamiliarity with philosophy. The reason that this is important is because it highlights the fact that being a scientist doesn't make him a trustworthy source of information when it comes to evidence for God's existence. We shouldn't believe what he says about religion just because he's a scientist.
No, that's just fine. I do know that, yes, just because someone is a scientist, they may not be the best in terms of philosophy. I mean, that's kind of where I come in, isn't it? I do consider myself to be highly adept at philosophy and reasoning and logic and really logical consistency. Being able to look at things and put them in a proper factual context, as I believe I'm about to demonstrate.
Third, if you notice toward the end of the video, Dr. Tyson issued a challenge, and I'd like to take him up on it. If you recall, he says,
But if you got some good evidence, bring it. Bring it.
Okay, I'll jump on the bandwagon here. Bring it!
Now, unfortunately, I haven't been doing this for
20 years.
Apparently that's the cutoff, but I'll give it a shot. In what follows, I'm going to lay out 3 pieces of evidence that I think support theism over naturalism. The first piece of evidence is the existence of dependent things. Everything in our experience exists dependently. This mug on my desk, for example, depends on other things for its existence. It hasn't always been here, it was built. My computer, my speakers, my headphones, my house, literally everything that we come in contact with depends on something else for its existence. And here's the really interesting thing about this, is that if you think about reality as a whole, all of reality exists independently. There can't be an outside explanation of everything that exists. That's actually impossible. Now, the reason why this is puzzling is because in the same way that you can't build a brick house out of water, you can't get an independent existence out of dependent things. Dr. Josh Rasmussen, who I've had on the channel a bunch, he calls this a construction problem.
I'm kind of confused by the point you're trying to make here. Reality itself appears to be independent. Yes. I think this relates back to what I was talking about, doesn't it? Is this similar to the idea of cause and effect, going all the way back? But I explained that. And the issue here is that one, this is basically the argument of it goes by a lot of different names: an uncaused cause, a first cause, an unmoved mover. And by all means, I mean, correct me if I'm misunderstanding you here, but the problem with that is that we don't know. The universe may be an infinite cycle of cause and effect, or the Big Bang, what started it all, could have just been the uncaused cause that we're talking about here. It could be the independent, an incident that was just independent of anything. And this is further complicated by the fact that it appears as though time itself originated at the moment of the Big Bang. So we're really at a loss to explain what, if anything, preceded that, or what might exist outside of that. It could literally be anything. And really, the what you're talking about, what I believe he gets to in a moment, the foundation you're talking about could absolutely be the universe itself. There's no reason it couldn't be. And any objection you might have to that would also apply to God. So, if let's follow Occam's razor for a moment, make the fewest necessary assumptions, we can just as well assume that the universe itself is the foundation, the beginning, and of everything. And there's no need for a God. You are needlessly creating, you're needlessly introducing the concept of a God that doesn't need to be there by any means.
Adding more and more dependent things together doesn't suddenly make the group independent. A group of 10 cameras, for example, is not suddenly independent because you have a group of 10. But again, the question is, how can all of reality exist independently when the building blocks of reality that we're familiar with exist dependently?
If the building blocks are dependent upon reality itself, that doesn't mean that reality must also be dependent. Your argument is making no sense whatsoever. The dependent components are dependent upon a foundation. Reality itself and the universe itself could very well be that foundation. There's no reason to believe that they aren't.
The solution to this problem of dependence, as it's known in the literature, is to posit a necessary foundation that has its existence independently. The reason that reality in total is independent, even though everything we experience is dependent, is because there is a necessary thing at the foundation of reality that explains everything else. This solves the puzzle, and notice what we have here. We have a necessary thing at the foundation of reality. Now, I think that this necessary thing would actually have to be perfect in order to have the kind of independent existence that it has.
Perfect according to who? What is your criteria for perfection? If reality itself and the universe itself are the foundation for everything, in a sense, that automatically makes them perfect. At least in the context of, this problem. Really, this, again, you may need to explain yourself better, or if I'm understanding you, then if I'm understanding your point correctly, then no, you're wrong. Reality itself and the universe itself are this foundation you're talking about. The components of reality and the components of the universe are dependent upon it. That doesn't mean that it must be dependent upon something else.
But let's turn and look at two additional pieces of evidence that I think help flesh out this concept further, that this necessary foundation is both personal and good. The second piece of evidence that I'll touch on is called fine-tuning.
Yeah, I knew this was coming. This is a pretty common argument. The problem here is, you know what, actually, let me go ahead and I'm going to let you make your argument, because I think it'll, I don't want to needlessly repeat anything going into it. But I'm going to preface this by saying the problem with it is human beings are notoriously fucking horrible at comprehending and applying probability. We suck at that.
The fact that our universe is life permitting is actually remarkable. If the conditions of our universe were just slightly different, life couldn't evolve anywhere in the cosmos.
That's actually correct, but I'm going to explain in a moment why this is very misleading. So, hold on.
Let's take an extreme example. Suppose that gravity for a moment didn't exist. Without gravity, there'd be no planets, no stars, no galaxies, nothing like what we see in our universe. Life can't exist in a universe where molecules don't stick together. Life needs an attractive force like gravity. But it doesn't just need any kind of gravity, it needs to be set at just the right strength. Physicists have estimated that if the strength of gravity had been just 1 part in 10 to the 60th stronger, then the universe would have just collapsed back in on itself right after the Big Bang. And if it had been 1 part in 10 to the 60th weaker, matter would have expanded too rapidly for stars and planets to form. Oh, and if you want a citation for these calculations, then check the link in the description. To put these numbers into perspective, getting the strength of gravity right for life by chance would basically be like the guy next to you at a poker table being dealt 10 royal flushes in a row by chance. I mean, it's technically possible that he's not cheating, like maybe he was dealt those hands fairly. But yeah, we all know that he was cheating. In the literature, there are about 10 to 12 cases of fine-tuning like this, and each one of these makes the problem worse and worse and worse for naturalism. Now, if you'd like to see my conversation with an actual cosmologist on all of the evidence for fine-tuning, check the link in the description. Now, just like it would be extraordinarily unlikely to be dealt 10 royal flushes in a row by chance, it would be extraordinarily unlikely that our universe would be life permitting by chance. Now, the reason that this is evidence for theism is that it's not so unlikely or improbable that a good God would want to create a universe that can support life. Think of it like fingerprint evidence in a court case. The probability that any two people would have the same fingerprint is about 1 in a billion. So finding a matching fingerprint at the scene of the crime doesn't prove with 100% certainty that this person is guilty, but it provides pretty good evidence for guilt over innocence. And so pretty much in exactly the same way, fine-tuning provides very good evidence for theism over naturalism.
Okay, good. No, it doesn't. The fine-tuning argument is pretty common. Now let's try to simplify this, and I mean, correct me if I'm not properly representing it. The universe as we know it, including us, is an outcome of these extremely specific parameters. These parameters with extremely specific values. And let's say, they're astronomically unlikely, as described here. So it's astronomically unlikely that these parameters would have these specific values. And this is what allowed the universe as we know it to exist, and this is the outcome we have, is, the universe that we know, and we ourselves, life in general. Okay. Here's the thing. When you're dealing with that many parameters, with that many potential values, Oh, and the first thing I should mention is that we can't even say with 100% certainty that this is that unlikely. I don't know. I don't know that these, values for these parameters are not, for example, the only stable values. I don't know that this outcome was not inevitable. In which case, we can't say for certain that it was unlikely, but let's assume it was. The problem is that when you're dealing with that many parameters, with that many potential values, any specific outcome is unlikely. Any specific outcome is exactly as astronomically unlikely as any other. And I'm glad you used playing cards as an example, because that's where I'm going to go with this. Take a deck of cards, okay? And, imagine you have a deck of cards. And shuffle them. Those cards are now in a specific order. They're in a randomized order, but they are in a specific order. The odds of them being in that exact order is as unlikely as them being in any other exact order. No matter what order you shuffled them into, no matter what the outcome was, it was bound to be unlikely. Now, you might make the claim, well, okay, but to have this universe exist and to have life come about in it, and for us to exist, is the equivalent of shuffling a deck of cards and getting it, let's say, in order from, 2 to ace in one suit, and then 2 to ace in the next suit, and, each suit like that. We still have a problem there. And the problem is we don't know that this outcome is analogous to that. We don't know that this outcome is special and or preferable compared to any other outcome. I'm sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought here. We don't know that this outcome is preferable. You can make the argument, what you're saying is that this outcome is preferable. It needs to be defined as preferable, though, by a standard that is external to the system. What I mean by that is that when you have, going back to the deck of cards, when you have, the 2 to the ace in each suit, in that order, it's defined as special by a standard established external to that sequence. Any sequence that you shuffled those cards into, no matter what, any sequence, is ideal if defined within its own context. What I'm getting at here is that, of course, this outcome, this universe as we know it, of course it's ideal to us. We are this outcome. We were produced by it. Our assessment that this outcome is ideal is inherently biased. The point here is that the evidence is that we were produced by this universe, and not necessarily that the universe was produced for our sake. And as a matter of fact, if you look around, the universe doesn't seem to be produced with, human beings in mind, because all of the universe, an insanely large percentage of it, everything except this one planet, is inhospitable. Tongue twister, isn't it, Jason? Is inhospitable to the life that is here on Earth. But again, you would need to demonstrate that this outcome was preferable to something external to this outcome, which in turn requires you to assume design from the beginning. It requires you to assume that there is something external to this outcome that decided it was preferable. So you're assuming design in order to prove design. And get this, we're not done yet, okay? Furthermore, if you can prove, that by some objective external factor this outcome is special or ideal, that still doesn't prove it was designed. You also need to prove that this universe, as it came about, is solitary in both space and time. That is to say that no other universes exist or ever did. Because when you've got that deck of cards that you shuffled it and it came out in this perfect order against all odds, you need to know how many times that deck was shuffled and how many decks were shuffled. How many decks were shuffled, how many times. And again, we don't know. We have no concept of what might lie beyond this universe, what came before this universe, what might come after this universe. We have no idea, if anything. And the funny thing is that theists have in the past, and sometimes still do, make the same argument, but instead of using the universe, use the planet Earth, which is even funnier. Because we know, in that case we know, and that demonstrates exactly what I'm talking about. If you take the Earth and say, well, look at all these things that had to happen in order for life to arise. The Earth had to be the perfect distance from the sun. We need the moon to regulate the Earth's orbit. All of these things that are conducive to life as we know it. But as it turns out, life as we know it was just an outcome of those circumstances. Like anything else, circumstances were conducive to an outcome and produced that outcome. Anywhere in the universe has distinctive features that are dependent upon the conditions that created it, because of course they are. An outcome is ideal to the standards that created it. And we know that there are, trillions upon trillions of stars out there, many of which do have planets around them, so we know that, in terms of the analogy, that deck was shuffled trillions upon trillions upon trillions of times, and there were trillions of decks being shuffled. Which means that even if this outcome is ideal by some objective standard, it doesn't prove design. It becomes much, much, much more likely when you've got, trillions of attempts to do it. So, no, we've gone through 2 points so far. The first one being completely nonsensical, that there has to be some foundation that is independent of anything else. That isn't necessarily the case. We can't be certain of that. And even if we can, there's no reason to believe that the universe itself is not the foundation and is independent, just because the components within it are dependent upon it. No kidding. The second one, the fine-tuning argument, sounds very compelling until you realize, I don't want to go through it all again, everything I just explained. So on point 1, no, that's not evidence of design. On point 2, no, that's not evidence of design either.
Now, the third piece of evidence that I'll discuss is called moral knowledge. And before I proceed, let me just make a quick distinction here. Traditional moral arguments say that God is necessary, or in some cases, God is the best explanation of moral facts.
I'm going to stop you right here for a moment and state my position on this. there's no such thing as a moral fact. Morality is inherently subjective. And this too, I just want to touch on this briefly. People often use the term moral relativity, or relative morals. Morality is relative. And in my opinion, that's a misuse of the term. And we should change it to subjectivity to avoid confusion. Because when we say relativity, or relative, everyone believes in moral relativity. Everyone believes morals are relative. Let me give you an example. Which is worse? Killing someone or stealing $1? Unless you're either a complete sociopath or you're lying, you're gonna answer that question. Killing someone is worse than stealing $1. Well, congratulations, you believe morality is relative. That's what relativity means. With relativity, you're asking the question, compared to what? So when we say like stealing $1 is wrong, if morality is relative, we're asking stealing $1 is wrong compared to what? And it's not as wrong as killing someone. Subjectivity, on the other hand, if we say something is subjective, we're saying according to who. That's different. Relativity is compared to what. Subjectivity is according to who. If you say stealing $1 is wrong, well, you're asking who says. And this is where people start getting... People tend to be very uncomfortable with the idea that morality is subjective. Because it scares people to have this idea, when you say something like... murder is wrong is just an opinion, people jump to the conclusion that, like, oh my God, you're saying murder is okay. You're saying that, it's okay to murder someone because it's just an opinion. And that's not exactly what it means. And this gets somewhat complicated to explain. So, if you've got the time... oh boy. Alright, let's kind of explain where our concept of morality came from. As a social species, we evolved a sense of empathy. That's what you refer to as your moral compass. Remember my term? That's an axiomatic threshold. Your moral compass is your sense of empathy. When we see someone suffering, and I mean there have been experiments, I believe, that have demonstrated this. So when you see someone suffering, it tends to activate corresponding regions in your brain as if you yourself were experiencing what they're going through. And that's essentially what your sense of empathy is. And they've found that those responses are not as strong, or in some cases, unless I'm mistaken, are absent in people who are, psychopaths or sociopaths, people who possess no empathy. For that reason, that their brains don't instinctively respond the same way. But that's where your instinctive sense of morality comes from. It's empathy. We don't like to see other people suffering, and of course, we feel bad if we're causing other people to suffer. The vast majority of us do. Oh, and here's the thing about instinctive empathy that it's very, very important to be aware of. Your instinctive empathy is variable. It changes based on how strongly you relate to and identify with an individual, or with anything really. If you feel more strongly associated with with someone, or I mean, in many cases, you can have this, toward not just toward other people, but toward animals as well. And if you would go so far as like inanimate objects, they're I'm sure just to some degree, there are people who feel at least some, like, not necessarily empathy, but some semblance of it toward particular inanimate objects. But I'm getting off topic here. The reason it's important to understand that, I would hope, is obvious, because some of the worst atrocities committed in human history have been committed because of a lack of empathy, because people were able to dissociate themselves and say, and look at other people and say, oh, for whatever reason, they're less human than I am. And so, and that actually enables people to ignore the suffering of others, at least to some degree. And that's why horrible things in our history. I mean, we, not just us, but like every civilization, practiced slavery for the longest time. And why? Because, the people doing it considered those they were enslaving to be beneath them and less human. And we had to come around to, the idea that, hey, these are also people, and this is morality as we know it is simply in our best interest. We've got instinctive empathy, and beyond that, we've got something I refer to as functional empathy, which is essentially recognizing that what you're doing always facilitates the same in your environment. This is it essentially leads to what's widely described as the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. That is not just a good suggestion, it's an inevitability. What you're doing influences your environment and facilitates the same in your environment, often inevitably welcoming the same upon yourself. It's not just that you should treat others as you want them to treat you. You are encouraging others to treat you the same way you treat them. You are, through your actions, encouraging the same from your environment. It's kind of an action-reaction thing. So even if you lack empathy in an instinctive sense, you should still recognize that it's in your best interest to treat others as you would like to be treated. Third, you have consequences imposed by your environment. And this is the other funny thing, that when arguing, in favor of, when arguing about subjective morality, people tend to, make the argument, well then, we can't have the legal system. If nothing is right or wrong, we can't have laws. Which, I mean, if you just stop and think about that for a moment, you'll realize what a stupid assertion it is. Of course we can have the legal system. We can make any laws we want. If nothing is wrong, then the laws we're making aren't wrong. None of them, no matter what. But it's in our best interest to make laws and have standards and behave as a group in a way that facilitates the outcome we hope to achieve. I don't want to be murdered. So obviously, I hope I hope this goes without saying. I have no desire to murder anybody. I have no desire to cause anybody any harm. I would feel terrible about that because, again, I have empathy. But assuming for a moment that, let's assume I have no empathy, I don't want to be murdered. I don't want to be harmed. Therefore, I support laws and support, laws and behavior in those around me that discourage people from committing murder and causing harm. And that's all this is. Our laws, our laws have nothing to do with what's right or wrong. They're simply what we believe to be conducive to the environment we hope to create. We don't want to be murdered. So we have laws against murder, and we have this implicit agreement with each other that, you don't murder me, I won't murder you, and we'll protect each other from those who disregard this, who feel that, they're just going to murder whoever the hell they want, or do what they want to who they want. So, at no point, and I do this within my ideology. In my ideology, some of the topics I touch on are that we don't actually have free will, and yet I construct a subjective approximation of free will and everything it entails to demonstrate that for all effects and purposes we do. We don't, it gets really hard to explain. We don't, but for all intents and purposes we do. And we are more or less charged with the responsibility of operating under that presumption. And as I just explained, there's no such thing as right or wrong. Nothing is right or wrong, and nothing needs to be right or wrong in order for us to have the sense of morality that we have. That said, I will describe things as wrong because it makes for useful shorthand. It's a lot easier to say murder is wrong than it is to go into this entire explanation about, well, murder is not conducive to, to an environment that I would, that I want to exist in. It's a lot easier to just say it's wrong. And again, for 99% of its applicable purposes, that's a close enough approximation. Yeah, it's wrong. Murder, theft, rape, what have you, are wrong. It just helps to understand the reality of it and where that's coming from, and that in an objective sense, and in a factual sense, there is no such thing as right or wrong. 2 + 2 is 5 is wrong. Murder is wrong is just a damn near unanimous opinion. It's an opinion that the vast majority of us share, but it is still an opinion and not a fact.
Without God, these arguments say, we're not actually obligated to do what's right or wrong. But the argument for moral knowledge isn't about what grounds moral facts. Rather, this argument is about the knowledge of moral facts.
Well, we can't have knowledge of moral facts if there are no moral facts. My contention is that there is no such thing as a moral fact.
Now, the reason that this distinction is important is because I'm not saying that God is necessary to ground objective morality. Maybe naturalism can account for moral facts. I don't know. What this argument focuses on is knowledge, knowledge of moral facts. A few months ago, I interviewed a professional philosopher named Eric Wielenberg on his case for objective morality. As an atheist, he thinks there are really good reasons to think that we have knowledge of objective moral facts. For example, he claims that we know that it's objectively wrong to torture infants for fun.
Again, I mean, that's a good example. Obviously, torturing infants for fun, yeah, that's fucking horrible. But that's still my opinion. It's the opinion of, just about everyone on Earth. That doesn't make it a fact. My challenge to you would be to prove, and yeah, wow, it sounds like horrible saying it, right? But I mean, objectively speaking, prove that torturing and killing infants is wrong factually.
From this point forward, I'm going to assume that you've watched that interview and are now convinced that we do have this kind of moral knowledge.
I haven't watched that interview. If you want to insist that I do, I'll take a look at it. But yeah, to me, there is no such thing as moral knowledge. We have a sense of empathy, and that's as close as we get to moral knowledge. Empathy. Again, morality is still subjective. You can't prove factually that something is morally wrong.
All right, with that out of the way, let's get to the argument. Now, on naturalism, it's quite surprising that unguided evolution would produce beings that have accurate beliefs about morality. Darwin actually realized the problem when he wrote, "If, for instance, to take an extreme case, men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering."
If we were born and raised under the same conditions as bees, I really need to think about what you're implying on that one. Again, our morality comes from empathy. And we did evolve empathy. It works to our benefit. Cooperation as a species has proven vital. I don't really see the point you're trying to make. Again, yeah, we evolved a sense of empathy. It really it helps us. It's profoundly useful to us as a species that we're not running around killing each other. I think it would be very hard for modern civilization to exist if we didn't have laws against, murder. If we didn't have empathy and see the strength, there is a great deal of strength in diversity. And it takes us time to realize that too. As horrible as this is, realize that tolerance is a fairly new concept. Racism, sexism, all kinds of prejudices, those had been the norm for a long time. We kind of had to come to this realization on our own that, it's more beneficial to us to cooperate and encourage diversity. So no, I don't really get what you're going for with that argument. We evolved the sense of empathy as a social species. And it's worked to our benefit, I think.
On naturalism, it would be an inexplicable, miraculous coincidence if our beliefs about morality somehow track the truth. And that's not a coincidence that naturalists can reasonably accept. This is exactly what naturalist philosopher Sharon Street wrote in a recent article she wrote entitled, "A Darwinian Dilemma for Realist Theories of Value." There she writes, "Allowing our evaluative judgments to be shaped by evolutionary influences is analogous to setting out for Bermuda and letting the course of your boat be determined by the wind and tides. Just as the push of the wind and tides on your boat has nothing to do with where you want to go, so the historical push of natural selection on the content of our evaluative judgments has nothing to do with evaluative truth."
Oh god, that's a mouthful. I probably should have watched this entire video first. Because now I've got to respond to this on the fly. Let's read this again. Allowing our evaluative judgments to be shaped by evolutionary influences. Again, you understand that our modern view of morality, this is relatively recent. Our ancestors were quite barbaric, and honestly, like for the longest time in human history, by most civilizations, it was considered entirely appropriate to abuse and or kill people just because they looked different than you. You had dominant races, dominant genders, and it was okay to abuse and in some cases kill those considered inferior. This was a realization that we came to pretty gradually. And again, like I said, that relates back to our sense of empathy and how it's evolved over time. And we developed into a more civilized species. This isn't something we were born with inherently. By all means, it would have been wonderful, wouldn't it, if we'd realized thousands of years ago what a horrible thing slavery was. Why is it that this is, here's a question for you. Why is it that God was okay with slavery for hundreds of years? Why didn't he speak up and say something? And why did he allegedly bestowed us with this, knowledge of right and wrong. We have not had a consistent view of right and wrong. We had basics, murder was wrong, but again, it was okay to murder those deemed inferior. In many civilizations, in many Christian civilizations, it has been okay to kill, murder, abuse those deemed inferior. So where is this? Where was this knowledge of right and wrong throughout human history while all of this was going on? For you to, honestly, you're to stand up and just self-righteously proclaim, we got this fantastic sense of right and wrong from God. No, we fucking didn't. And if we did, God did a horrible fucking job of it. Because of all the shit that we've done through human history, we have not had a very solid concept of right and wrong. We've kind of fucked up a lot. And I say this all in past tense. We're still fucking up a lot. We're improving. We're getting there. And again, like when I say improving, when I speak as though these are objective values, when I say, that this is the direction we should be heading in, make no mistake, I'm not speaking objectively. I'm saying in the interest of, facilitating a peaceful society that maximizes the safety and comfort of all of us, that's an ideal direction to be headed in. You know, to have developed this sense of morality. But no, no, this is definitely not something that we were, designed or created with. We've done some horrible shit in our past, our species. We've done horrible shit. Okay? We had to figure all this out for ourselves. There was no knowledge ingrained in us. The most knowledge we had was, hey, I don't like when this happens to me. I don't like feeling like this. I don't like being hurt. I don't like being murdered. I probably shouldn't do that to other people either. There's no moral truth. It's just empathy.
Of course, it's possible that as a matter of sheer chance, some large portion of our evaluative judgments ended up true due to a happy coincidence, but this would require a fluke of luck that's not only extremely unlikely in view of the huge universe of logically possible evaluative judgments and truths, but also astoundingly convenient.
What are you talking about? There's nothing like astoundingly convenient about this. Again, the only thing that led to our sense of, if you want to call it moral truth, the only thing that led to our sense of morality is, again, the development of empathy and saying, I don't like when this happens to me. Maybe I shouldn't do it to other people.
The link to Street's paper, if you want to read it, is in the description. Street's point is that evolution could have produced beings with any number of moral beliefs. It's therefore extremely unlikely that unguided evolution would just happen to produce beings with the correct set of moral beliefs.
Wow. This is another case of proving that conditions were designed for a given outcome by assuming that outcome was ideal. No, the outcome is a product of the conditions. Had we... do you not realize this? How do you not realize this? If you're making the argument, and really, given the circumstances, this is the outcome that was most likely and sustainable. But all right, you're saying that we could have wound up with any set of moral beliefs, but we ended up with the right ones. This is just frustratingly stupid. I'm sorry. Whatever moral beliefs we ended up with, we would call those the right ones. We would say we wound up with the right moral beliefs. If we wound up with the moral beliefs that said kill and torture the babies, we would go, wow, those are the right moral beliefs. How did we wind up with the right moral beliefs? How did we find out? How did we come upon the objective knowledge that it's a good thing to torture and kill the babies? You're assuming the outcome is right just because it is the outcome that we have, and then going, the circumstances must have been specifically designed to produce that outcome because it's the right outcome. Oh my fucking God. Like, really? That's what this all comes down to? How did we end up being right? Because we consider ourselves right. We would consider ourselves right no matter where we ended up. And we would go, wow, we were right. You're making my head hurt, dude.
This would be like setting sail across the Atlantic Ocean with no steering mechanism and just happening to arrive at the right port.
No! It would be like setting sail across the Atlantic and just wherever you wound up, deciding that was where you were supposed to end up, and then going, wow, how did I end up at just the right spot? Because you decided wherever you ended up was right. I can't fucking, I'm like, really? How does this, how do you not get this? We assume, you assume that where we are is right, and then wonder how we got to the right. That's exactly what I'm saying. You, like, wow, this is the right place to be. How did I wind up in the right place? Just close your eyes and walk in a straight line for like 10 feet. Okay? You close your eyes, spin around, and then walk 10 feet and decide wherever you ended up was the right place. I explained, there's no such thing as objective morality. There's no such thing as moral truths. All we have is, I realize I'm repeating this a lot, but I mean, it bears repeating. All that we have is, I don't like when this happens to me. It would probably be best if I don't do it to others. For the reasons I explained.
It's possible to do that, but it's just extremely unlikely. On theism, however, it's not so unlikely that a good God would want to create beings with reliable beliefs about morality. Since knowledge is good, and knowledge of right and wrong is good, a good God would want us to know right and wrong. And, obviously, he'd know what cognitive equipment we would need in order to discover moral truth.
God would want us to have the exact values and the exact things, the exact... You're basically saying God would want us to end up exactly the way we ended up, so therefore God exists. Bravo! You're a fucking brilliant. You're a genius. We ended up perfect. No, and we didn't. We didn't end up perfect. I just explained to you, like, we've had really shitty moral compasses throughout our history. At what point, again, I'm going to bring this up again. I want an answer to this. Why was God okay with slavery? We practiced slavery for the longest time, just in this country, and I mean, it's been practiced throughout history for so long. And I'm not even going to go to the Bible. Because, I mean, you can make the argument that the Bible itself condones slavery, but why was God okay with it? And why, I mean, you can try to make the argument that, like, well, it was wrong, but we had to figure it out. But that's exactly my point. We had to figure it out. Are you honestly telling me that the people who practiced slavery, all of them, and all of the people who were okay with it and who permitted it to happen, they were aware, their moral compass was aware that it was wrong, but they just chose to do it anyway? No, they justified it. They thought it was okay. They said, this is okay. They believed it was right. They believed their God created other people inferior to them. And by the way, there are other species that demonstrate some manner of empathetic behavior. I believe primates, obviously. Primates are very close to humans in many ways because they're, obviously, they're our, closest evolutionary relative. But I believe bats, I'm not sure about all bats, but, certain species of bats display certain behaviors. Like if a bat didn't get enough food, other bats will share their food with it. I think we see this behavior in ants. We see this behavior in other animals. It's an evolved trait that is conducive to the survival of a species. And if you want to know why, like, if you want to, pick out one example, like the bees, like the example you gave before, well, why don't bees? Because that's what worked for them in an evolutionary sense. The males of the bees, male bees, their only function really is reproduction. It's they don't serve as much of a function, so they mate and they die. Evolution is not design. It's just things work out the way they work out. Unless I'm mistaken, I think ants are very much the same. Like I said, you see these like empathetic behavior in ants, that they'll care for each other when they're injured. But I think all ants are female, except for the drones that mate and then die. So again, it depends on the circumstances under which a species evolves and how they evolve. But to say that our morality is inherent is wrong. Again, it's because for you, morality is an axiomatic threshold. You don't know where it's coming from, so you attribute it to something supernatural. But it isn't. And there is no, moral truth or moral facts.
Theism has the explanatory resources, in other words, to explain moral knowledge.
Theism proposes the false concept of moral knowledge. Moral knowledge, what you call moral knowledge, what you're referring to as moral knowledge, is perfectly explained by, again, the evolved trait of empathy.
In the same way that a life-permitting universe is strong evidence for theism, moral knowledge is strong evidence for theism. Now, in response to this third piece of evidence for moral knowledge, atheists will sometimes say that the God of the Bible can't actually be the good God that we're talking about here because he commanded really atrocious things in the Bible. Let me give 3 quick thoughts on this. First, this is a great rhetorical strategy because it's actually a really emotional subject, and so it has really high rhetorical appeal. Playing on people's emotions is actually a really effective strategy. Advertisers use it all the time. Second, while this objection is clearly worth thinking about and addressing, it's completely unrelated to my argument, like completely unrelated. Nothing in this argument at all requires the assumption that the Bible is the inspired word of God. In other words, this objection is actually kind of a way of avoiding my argument.
So you're pretty much dismissing this objection. First you say, well, it's an appeal to emotion, which, I mean, I guess you could see it that way. It's kind of, it does appeal to emotion, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that was the motive for putting it forward. Second, you say, well, there's no reason to believe that the Bible is the Word of God, which is good because I don't believe God exists, and therefore the Bible can't possibly be His Word. But what isn't that what you believe? That the Bible is the Word of God? If we're just throwing our hands up and saying, well, God is whatever we do on God's behalf, well, that's not really God. Then that's a problem for your, you can dismiss anything that way. If you're essentially saying that God is perfect and only the good that we do can be attributed to God, you're being selective for the explicit purpose of supporting your assertion that God is perfect. You're just creating excuses. You're like, well, God's perfect and He created us with this moral knowledge. Well, what about where this moral knowledge comes up short? And you're saying, oh, well, that wasn't God. No, sorry, it doesn't work like that. if you want to blame, if you want to credit God with our moral knowledge, then he needs to take responsibility for all of it. And what was the third point you tried to make? That wait, now I need to go back and play it again. I'm sorry.
At all requires the assumption that the Bible is the inspired word of God. In other words, this objection is actually kind of a way of avoiding my argument. Third, if you didn't know this, Christians have not been silent on these types of objections.
Okay, yeah, your third point is referencing something else. I mean, at this point, your arguments so far have been so poor, and I have no reason to expect any of the things you're referencing to be any better. If you want to convince me, I'm not gonna accept this like boatload of homework where you're referencing me to all these other videos and articles. If you want to make a convincing argument, you have the responsibility to do it yourself. Summarize these things if you must. But I'm not gonna run all over the place and research all of these other things that you're referencing, when if that's where you're getting your ideas from, I don't expect much from them.
Third, if you didn't know this, Christians have not been silent on these types of objections. Christian philosopher Paul Copan, for example, has a great book called Is God a Moral Monster?, where he addresses all of these kinds of objections. So by raising this objection, atheists aren't making like a definitive point against Christianity. Really what they're doing is just opening a real big theological can of worms.
No, you're not making a very good argument for Christianity. I mean, I don't know what else to tell you. You're trying to dismiss this objection. You're saying, well, let's just ignore it. I don't know. Personally, do you believe in hell? Because that's a really funny thing about God. Is God a moral monster? If you believe in hell, then yes, he absolutely is. No one, no matter what they do, could possibly deserve an eternity of any degree of suffering. And your God is willingly condemning people to it. Again, if you believe in hell. I don't know. Some Christians don't. I can't keep track of all that. And by the way, why hasn't God clarified in terms that, can be clear to everyone? There are thousands of different religions, and under each one, so many different denominations, so many different specific beliefs. Why is God incapable of clarifying in no uncertain terms? If he exists, this shouldn't be a problem for him. Alright, so it looks like I'm going to have to do this video in two parts. Because as I'm going through this and putting it together, I'm realizing this is going to be like a 3-hour-long video. And I think breaking it up into two parts will, one, make it more digestible in a sense, and two, give me the opportunity to have something available, uploaded immediately, and then I'll be able to post the second half probably over the weekend. Whereas, if I wait to put the entire thing together, I would only be able to post, the whole thing not until the weekend. Honestly, I had considered not even bothering with the second half for two reasons, really. One is I'd actually only watched the first half before I decided to respond, and my response was primarily to the first half. It was to those 3 alleged pieces of evidence for God's existence. So the second half was really more an immediate reaction as I watched. I mean, that's what you were seeing. It works better to be able to formulate a response rather than just right away. I'm still going to post it, but it's not as well, planned out. Second, and more importantly, The second half really dealt more with internal consistencies within the Bible and Christianity and the larger God narrative. And those are not really relevant to its validity. That is to say, you can, close as many plot holes and rationalize as many inconsistencies as you want, but that's not going to make it any more credible. You need some evidence that it's true, not just the ability to retcon it and again to just rationalize any inconsistencies. So I'm still going to produce and upload the second half, but my main point is contained within this first half. Let's go ahead though and summarize that first half. It's essentially a response to 3 points. 3 points that this individual claims are evidence for the existence of God, and in fact are not at all. Point number one. I make the case that there is no reason to believe that the universe is not the independent foundation on which all of its components are dependent. There's no reason it can't be. There's no reason to assume it isn't. There's no reason not to assume that it is. The universe itself doesn't need to be dependent on anything. Every rule that we have for everything in the universe does not necessarily apply to the universe itself. Anything that you can say, in that context about God can be said about the universe itself. On the second point, to cite the alleged fine-tuning of the universe as evidence for any kind of design in any sense is analogous to shuffling a deck of cards, and no matter what order they end up in, to declare that order special and preferable without any external standard to confirm whether it's special and preferable. And then furthermore, to assess the probability of that outcome without any knowledge of how many other decks were shuffled or how many times those decks were shuffled in order to produce the outcome in question. On point number 3, there is no such thing as moral knowledge. Our morality is a product of our sense of empathy, both in an instinctive sense and in the sense that we recognize the reciprocative nature of our environments and realize that certain behaviors are more conducive to the secure, peaceful environment we desire. Our morality was not bestowed upon our creation, nor is it reflective of some greater truth. It is merely a reflection of our desire, again, for a secure and peaceful existence. And it has been continuously and continues to be developed and refined to that end throughout our history.